breaking down everyday workplace issues and diagnosing the hidden sickness, not just the obvious symptom. Our hosts, James and Kobe.
Did we lose a patient?
No, that's just my lunch.
Hey, thanks for joining us. I'm Kobe, he's James, and let's get started with a question. What happens when we have mass public sector layoffs?
Yeah, okay. Before answering this question, the actual question, I think it's important to establish a little bit of context about why are we talking about public sector layoffs. Well, at the time that we're recording this, there have been several fairly monumental changes proposed or implemented at the federal public service, to the federal public service in the United States. So I'm going to try to lay out the facts as I understand them, but let's be real, not being American and recognizing that things change very, very quickly, I've not been hanging on every news release, news article, press release, or statement that has come out. But in the past 2 weeks, in the first 2 weeks of his second term, President Trump has started to follow through on some of his campaign promises to reduce the federal bureaucracy and the perceived bloat within the federal civil service. So there have been a few major events happen to advance those goals. One is the suspension of all DEI workers and a mandate to close all DEI offices within the next 60 days. Right now, it's unclear how many people this has affected. The second piece is the reintroduction of Schedule F, which reclassifies permanent policy-related positions from career positions to become politically appointed positions. And it's estimated that tens, if not hundreds of thousands of positions could be affected by this change alone. And then the third major event was that an estimated 2 million government employees received a deferred resignation offer via email. And essentially, if they resigned by February the 6th, they would retain their salary and their benefits until September. If even 10% of the people affected by this were to accept the layoff, or the deferred resignation, it would represent the single largest layoff in U.S. history by a factor of 3. So all of those things together, the stated intent of these changes aren't in and of themselves bad. The stated reasons for these changes are to reduce government waste and increase government efficiency. Both goals that I believe are important. Where I disagree, and quite substantially, and we'll get into that, I'm sure, in more detail in this conversation, is the manner in which these goals are being advanced. I don't know the U.S. Federal Civil Service nearly as well as I know the Canadian Federal Civil Service, because I have worked around, and worked with Canadian governmental agencies for many, many years. And I am truly convinced that there is a tremendous opportunity to increase efficiencies in our, both provincially, federally, in our civil service as well. So stated goals aren't necessarily terrible. Let's examine what happens when we put some of these policies into place without necessarily a strategy for how we are going to reform afterwards.
Yeah, and I think that it's also kind of good for us just to mention too that this whole episode isn't going to be about us just talking about the recent events from the Trump administration. I want to talk a little bit about what's happened in public sector layoffs in the past, here in Canada.
Yeah.
We can talk a little bit about kind of what mass layoffs do in general. And I think that I always like it when we kind of look at something that's kind of topical with a historical perspective and an economic development perspective, because I do think those add a lot of value and a lot of clarity to kind of some, stuff that's kind of top of mind right now.
Well,
So,
especially with governmental changes. right?
Yeah.
There's direct, significant impact that the delivery of governmental services has on our economies.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, kind of digging into a little bit about the idea around, I, I think one of the biggest things that, the biggest impacts of the things that you mentioned is probably the federal employees receiving the resignation email, right?
The deferred resignation is it's huge. I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of people could be affected.
Yeah, and I mean, like the idea of like one of the things that always gets me, and this is going to be kind of where I think we're going to end up, is the idea of reducing government, like like bloated government spending and kind of like and the overly bureaucratic kind of layers and kind of that that large even that large like kind of middle management stuff
Mhm.
that tends to kind of exist in a lot of governments over time. The idea of kind of like trimming the fat in a sense is something that there's value in looking at how can we be more effective, how can we be more efficient. But the problem with I guess people that have built their careers in the private sector thinking they can just automatically transfer what they feel worked. I would disagree that it works in the private sector as well. But the idea of, well, if there's bloat, you cut the fat is something that I see that people have, valued that approach in the past in in the public sector. But sorry, in the private sector, but in the public sector, it's the idea of things are different. The goal is the efficiency is not meant to be about money spent as much as it is about quality of service
Yes.
because you are serving the public. Like the name couldn't be more descriptive. I mean, like you say civil service, I actually prefer the term public service because to me that's
Mhm.
more descriptive. The goal is to serve the public. So efficiencies are about how much better can we serve the public? How can dollars be spent to increase what the public gets?
Yeah.
And I feel like when we try and just cut and paste things that work in, business, which is about profitability, saving money, that type of thing. And, and that's the intended goal. And we forget the whole point of public service is to serve the public. And that so it's a flawed idea, but it's a flawed idea with no corresponding
Yeah.
one-to-one connection that people often forget about.
I've often railed against so one of the things that drives me absolutely bananas is when you have career people who have worked in government for 20 years and never worked anywhere else, creating rules around how businesses operate, or business support programs, because there's a distinct lack of understanding if you've never worked in that realm of what it actually takes to start and run and grow a business. The same is true when you try to go the other way. And this is what we're seeing. We're seeing people who have a lot of private sector experience who've never taken the time to understand or look at how governments actually operate differently than a private sector corporation, and are just implementing rules that they think should work because this is what they've always done in the past, not recognizing the nuance and the difference between governmental agencies and corporate entities.
Yeah. Well, but I mean, you and I are not a big fan of blanket layoffs in any
No.
workforce ever, right? So we always talk about how, that's something that it's a reactionary effort to a problem that is overly simplistic, but it's flashy. Like really, layoffs are the performative solution of operational, efficiencies. It's like we want something that's flashy, that's big, that's gonna show a really quick win, lay everybody
Show
off.
our shareholders that we're doing something significant, that we're taking this
Yeah,
problem seriously.
yeah.
Yeah.
And in a lot of ways, that's what it is. But like, so you made the comparison, off camera about It is like my doctor says I need to lose weight to be healthy, so I'll just cut my arm off, and boom, there's like, 10 pounds gone. So therefore, I must be healthier,
Yeah.
right?
It's
Like
that it's that same mentality
it
of,
is. Like
hey,
it's a
we need to
stupid
make,
example, but it's accurate.
well, it's a stupid example, but it's also a stupid thought process to begin with. And
Yeah.
if your actual goal is to lose, if losing weight is the means by which you're trying to achieve your goal, right? Your goal is to become healthier. Your goal is for government to become more efficient.
Yeah.
The means by which you get there have it's the ends do not justify the means in all situations, and the means are very important,
Yeah.
right? Cutting off your arm to lose weight does not, yes, it accomplishes the means of losing weight. It does not accomplish the goal of becoming healthier. Laying off tens, hundreds of thousands of people or more, we don't know what the effects are going to be.
Mhm.
Yeah, government will end up spending less money on salaries because there will be fewer people delivering services. Will
Yeah.
that make government inherently more efficient? No. It's going
No.
to create substantial gaps in service delivery.
Yeah, well, I think so. Again, we're saying this isn't a good thing. I think we can come to that agreement. But let's talk about why we think it's a good thing, and let's look back with some historical perspective to not that long ago. And we'll look at an example here in Canada, just to kind of say what happened when there was mass public sector layoffs.
Yeah.
So in 2012, the Harper government here in Canada laid off 19,000 public sector employees, which was about almost 5% of total government employees.
Mhm.
You know, a huge number,
Good chunk.
much less than what we're talking about happening kind of currently, but still a pretty significant
Yeah.
portion. Okay, and the fallout of that again, the idea of cuts were to save money,
Yeah.
smaller government, all the
We're
usual.
now 13 years removed from that event, and we can look back and actually see what was the effect of that.
Yeah. And the effect of it wasn't a lot of positive things. There was a decrease in the public service capacity. There was less people to do the work to serve the public. There was a lot less where there was reduced consumer spending because a lot of the jobs that were cut were middle income families.
Yeah.
So it had a major impact on the middle class because the private sector saw a big drop in consumer spending because there was less money to be spent because all these stable middle level income families now were didn't have the income. There was significant service delays and disruption going back to the decreased public sector capacity. And what happened when you have those delays and disruptions? In the short term, you're like, yeah, we save money on the salaries, but what happens is that downstream economic consequences come in.
Yeah.
And this required provincial and municipal governments to majorly increase their spending and their investments, like, a year or two later, to restore lost service, to cover the gaps. And that's one thing that it's almost like it's all you're doing is you're just, when these kind of disruptions happen, you're just passing the buck on to someone else. You're like, well, that's next year's government's problem, not my problem today.
Yeah.
And that's one thing people don't realize, that even when you do these cuts and you see that short term, quarter savings, you're seeing massive increase in, a couple quarters down the road because you have to fill that gap with something.
And it's important to note that the effects are disproportionate as well.
Yeah.
When we're talking about how this impacts local economies, rural communities end up getting hit very, very hard by these types of cuts because in many rural communities, if there are government agencies that are set up there, they're often above the median income levels,
Right.
right? So you end up losing the economic impact and the ability for people to engage in economic activities, going out to eat, buying new whatever, you know, participating in society the way that we've told people that to be successful in society, you have to buy stuff.
Mm.
It removes that ability to do it, and it has a ripple effect throughout rural communities in a much more profound way than it does in many urban areas.
Yeah, so really, if you're listening to this and you are someone that you know owns a small like retail sales business in a rural community, you're gonna feel this
You
in
could
about
very well. I mean,
6 months. You are definitely gonna feel this, and you'll be like, "Why?" And this is exactly why. It's the downstream economic consequences.
yeah. And
But
this
the
is
other
the
thing,
piece that irritates me though, because I mean, I said it at the beginning. I don't disagree with the stated intent,
Mhm.
right? There are there is a lot of government waste. We've seen it firsthand in our dealings in different agencies and different levels, and like there's absolutely room for improvement. But what never gets talked about is actual reform. It's never about what can we do differently. It's
No,
what can we cut? What can we get rid of? Where's the access? And let's just get rid of. And we're talking about people, which
yeah.
is the other thing. And like it's
Well,
so counterintuitive to me.
but this is it, is going back to, again, our favorite villain is performative solutions.
Yeah.
And cuts and layoffs are performative. They're not actually about solving the problem. Reform is about solving the problem.
Yeah.
But reform is complex. Reform takes time. Reform is about trying something, evaluating it, and then adjusting as you go.
Yeah.
It's not simple, it's not flashy, and it's not short term.
And you're probably not going to get it right the first time out of the gate.
It
It
requires,
requires a substantial commitment,
yeah.
political will, perseverance,
Mhm.
strategy.
Yeah. Well, and this is just it, is that, like, I think that you and I are in an excellent position to talk about reform, because though it's not a term we use in our business, in our positioning, the way we talk to clients, but it is exactly what we do. We do reform in, with the clients that we work with. We help them reform their governance structures. We help them reform their operational efficiency. We reform their employee experience.
Yeah.
We help them assess, evaluate, create a strategy, and support the long-term change of this. And we know how hard it is. We know what is required from the people to stick it through, and we know how hard it is to sell. But it's something that, if governments are talking about layoffs, or talking, I don't know, sorry, they're talking about bloat, talking about overly bureaucratic stuff, and they're not talking about reform, they are comfortable with the performative solution. They actually don't want the problem solved. They want to look like the problem is being addressed.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, the thing that gets to me. And we saw this back again in 2012, with the public sector cuts of the 4 to 5% of total government employees, right? And again, but like, part of the negative impact of this, again, there was a lot in the middle class, but ultimately, who always suffers are the lower income families, the seniors, the vulnerable communities.
Yeah.
And what happens is that it's something that, because it's kind of like we talk about, the idea of labor value loss, and money's, the losses aren't showing up on the balance sheet. They're just being felt, and everything's being slowed down because they're not easy to see and they're not flashy. Then it's something that then they get ignored. But
The
like,
pain experienced by those communities does not show up on a government balance sheet.
no. But I think something that also is, keep in mind, what makes a cut to the public sector, public service, so much more, like, the ripple effects of it is so much greater than it is in the private sector, is I think, let's talk a little bit about, like, one of the biggest layoffs kind of to date in the
Yeah,
US
the
was.
The IBM layoff in
Yeah.
93, I think, is the single large to date. I mean,
Yeah.
none of the things that we've been talking about have gone through yet. So
Yeah.
it's still the largest historical event to date. And it was 60,000 employees, which is
Yeah.
a huge number, right?
Absolutely.
In 93, I think IBM posted a loss of like $8 billion dollars. And
Yeah, I'm not sure if that's kind of when like they say kind of like the dot com or the internet bubble burst or something like that. There's some economic impact that happened, but yeah, they lost.
it
Yeah, it
was
was like 8
before I
billion.
was paying an awful lot of attention to business.
Really? When you
Yeah.
were in like junior high, this
Yeah.
wasn't something
When
that
I
you
was 11. Yeah.
but yeah, so but the thing is that it was an awful situation, and those that experienced it, were dealt with massive issues and problems and all that kind of stuff.
I mean, the ripple effects still happen, right? You
Yeah.
cannot lose 60,000 jobs from a community or from an area and
Hmm.
not have that ripple through the entire community that's affected, right? It was the same
Absolutely.
type of like people losing employment. They are not spending money the same way. It's the proverbial, well, it's time to tighten our belts. We need to survive and get through this.
Yeah.
But it's also localized, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because one thing, and I mean, even I'm sure even in 93, I'm sure IBM was pretty spread out, but it was probably spread out mostly in like,
It
Southern
would have affected a
California
number
or
of different
yeah.
communities, right?
Yeah,
Like it,
exactly. Yeah. But at the same time, but it was largely mostly affected the people immediately who were laid off, their families, likely and then likely their neighbors and communities because of decreased spending and that kind of stuff. But it was fairly localized. But when you're talking about the public service, the public sector, that is something that is everywhere because it affects everything from healthcare to education to environmental protection to, like just kind of like everything.
Microsoft customers probably did not notice any change in product or service as
Mhm.
a result of those
Or
60,000.
minor if there was.
Yeah, right? Like if
Yeah.
you would have to be very hyper vigilant and understand the nuances of what they offer. Like
Mhm.
if there was an effect on the beyond the employee, on the consumer, on those who receive the benefits of the work that was being done,
Yeah.
then it would have been very, very minor.
Mhm.
But that doesn't translate from private sector to public sector
Right.
because you start removing people who are delivering services, who are responsible for developing programs or for managing budgets or for ensuring that paper is processed properly so
Mhm.
people can receive their benefits. You start removing those people from doing their jobs, and it's not about a product that is going to be delayed going out the door. It's about people not receiving the services that they need to, in some cases, not every case, but in some cases, literally to survive.
Yeah. And that's just it, is that if there are, so what we're saying is that there's going to be negative, there's going to be negative kind of economic consequences to kind of rural businesses. It's going to be one thing that happens with mass public sector layoffs. There's going to be decrease in service and a much more slowed down, like delays and disruptions, specifically to low income families, seniors, and vulnerable communities.
Yeah.
And that's something that again, was exactly what happened in Canada when 4% of government employees, 4 to 5% was let go. It's when you look at kind of other things that have happened in like the UK and in Europe, it's very similar. Like these things happen very, like they happen, pretty consistently no matter what happens.
Yeah.
And this is just this is who is going to be the most affected by these things. And I think I want to like just jump kind of briefly to the side and cover one more of the things that you mentioned kind of off the top of the current situation and talk a little bit about the DEI and employees in offices.
Yeah.
So,
I'll allow it.
all right, thank you, sir. Um, so let's be clear. You and I are not a fan of layoffs. We were on the record for that. But you and I are also not the biggest fan of the way that DEI has been implemented in most organizations that we've come across.
In
Private,
North America, as a blanket statement, we
yeah,
can, yeah.
yeah. Partially because as much as we hate the performative aspect, especially of cuts, right?
Hmm.
The implementation of DEI has been kind of just as performative, right?
It has. I mean, we've talked about this on the podcast many times
Mhm.
before.
Yeah,
We've talked about the mentality of diversity plus equity somehow magically creates inclusion,
yeah,
right? The idea that for many companies, the DEI was about looking good rather than about being good.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely. And that's just it. And I mean, and a lot of the employees that were hired into a lot of, government organizations and a lot of private companies and corporations were brought in and given very little authority, were given very little actually long-term support, were devalued, but and then were ineffective.
yeah.
And it's one of those things where again, we are very much in support of what the ideas around diversity, equity, and inclusion being in a workplace should do. It's about removing barriers so that meritocracy can be accessible to everyone.
Yeah.
That's the point. Like, and one thing that frustrates me is when I hear all the idea of the argument against DEI is meritocracy. We're like, well, if you're stupid, yeah. But because the whole point of what improving belonging, removing barriers, and supporting effective representation is about pulling down the roadblocks
Yeah.
so that meritocracy is not only for people at advantages, that
Yeah.
meritocracy, the hiring by merit, is available to everyone. That's the point. And when DEI was put into place to just to look good on public on your website, or just to have positions that you can point to saying, yeah, we're solving this issue, but no change happened, no support was given, there was no authority allowed. It did not remove the barriers, so meritocracy was allowed for everyone. It was a failure.
Hmm.
And so there's a sense of, what we're going to see is we're going to see, with these DEI layoffs, we're going to see that it's going to be a sweep across the whole spectrum of organizations in the
Oh,
U.S.
it's already swept.
Yeah,
It's already gone beyond just
it's
federal and
it's going to go into Canada. It's
yeah.
it's it's going to go into the UK, into Europe. It's going to happen everywhere. And there's a sense of, well, the why they're doing it is kind of, is complicated. Yes, it's not working, but it's not working because it was done badly.
Stated intent,
Yeah.
and using that phrase intentionally,
Hmm.
the stated intent is that these programs aren't working, so they need to go.
Right.
If you agree with that stated intent, then again, it's going back to the performative solution of just cutting people, like cutting programs, cutting people versus, well, if it's not working, then what can we do differently to make it work? How can we reform this into something that does accomplish the goals that it's supposed to do?
And that's just it. So if you're in a business or you're in a position where, the idea of, well, the DEI winds have shifted and everyone's cutting it, so we're going to jump on board. Take a beat and think again about reforms because that really is the
Even
answer.
reforming your language if you want to get away from the, because there, let's be honest, there's, with these changes there's going to be some preconceived notions about DEI, and
Mhm.
so focus on belonging,
Yeah.
focus on creating an environment where everyone can
Mhm.
belong for who they are. That's not DEI, that's being a decent human being.
Or the idea of, if because what it's so funny. I think a rye, a contender for 2025's word of the year, I'm going to call it in early February, um, is going to be meritocracy. That's going to
Yeah.
be a real runner for, so make it about that, but make it about making making a meritocracy accessible to everyone.
Well, and in order to
Could
do that,
be,
you need to recognize that there are some
yeah.
ways in which we've created systems.
Hmm.
Historically, unintentionally, we've created systems that provide advantages to some and disadvantages to others.
Yeah.
That meritocracy cannot exist in a environment where advantages are provided to some,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's not about necessarily removing advantage. Maybe it's removing advantages, but I'd rather you focus on removing the disadvantages, the things that put people at a disadvantage, right? Looking at how we actually structure our organizations, looking at how we create systems and processes and resources and tools and all of these things how we approach our companies to remove barriers to allow the best and brightest to want to work with us.
And that's just what it is. It's like, and one of the things that we talk about when we go in and do, again, these organizational reforms is we talk about, usually we actually have them change how they do DEI if they have something like that, because
Yeah.
again, we're usually very unhappy with how it's being done. And one of the things we talk about is we say, the idea of inclusion and belonging really should be whether you want to use that language now because it's kind of tainted, like you said, or not, but that's the idea of how can we as a company allow you to give us your best work
Yeah.
is really the only real question that matters.
And that
And
question needs to be asked to everybody.
exactly. Because the whole point is like, regardless of their overt barriers or their overt background, everybody, even the most advantaged person, likely still would benefit from some level of customization to allow them to give you their best work. Everyone should be asked that question. And that should be the question of meritocracy, right?
Yeah.
And that is one thing that we're going to want to, maybe reframe this, but I do think that making meritocracy available to everyone could be how we in our organizations still reach the actual stated goals of DEI, but shed the baggage and the language and shed the all the stuff that went wrong with it. I do think that may be a way to go.
Yeah.
So I think the last thing I do want to kind of get into is we talked about reform. We talked about there is ability for public service to be improved and there actually to actually achieve the goals that you want to. And if we want to say, okay, so we talked about how in Canada, things have gone wrong. We kind of said this, it's been similar in other countries, like, and across Europe and the UK and stuff like that. So where has this idea of reform been successful? I think is a fair question.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think probably not a lot of people know is that Singapore is actually an amazing example of what,
Of public sector reform.
yes, and how amazing it can be.
Yeah.
So, if you listening to this are not familiar with Singapore's government, one, I wouldn't be that surprised. It's like unless you're a nerd like us and
Well,
you look
that's
at
we had
economic.
an opportunity to participate in a global advisor program several years ago and met a phenomenal contact advisor in Singapore.
Mhm.
And I mean, let's be honest, this is how we came across it was because it was the information was given to us by somebody who experienced it and lived in it. And one, that program was phenomenal, and but hearing the way it was framed as um, really focused on the delivery of service, on the quality of services being delivered rather than purely the numbers of people delivering services. I mean, there's a lot more nuance that we'll get into, but it was a really interesting conversation and very enlightening to see how you can accomplish the big objectives of significant government reform and do it in a way that actually come your services, the people who experience the benefits of your governmental services actually have a better outcome at the end of it rather than a worse one, which is what we've is really the only experience we've seen
Yeah.
is cuts equal disruptions.
Yeah. Cuts make problems worse. Maybe in the long term, there may have been some shine, some rays of light in those cuts, but they're almost always worse.
Yeah.
Like,
Unless they are accompanied by doing something differently.
unless they're not just performative, which to
Yeah.
be honest, we were looking back again, we were doing our homework for this episode, and we were looking back, and we couldn't find too many examples, really, well, I say too many, any
Well, the
real,
problem is because reform generally doesn't work in a 4-year election cycle. And governments don't want to put policies, processes, procedures in place today that they're not going to be able to take credit for in when an election time happens in 3.5 years. I mean,
yeah.
really, if we're talking about this realistically,
Mhm.
that's one of the biggest irritations that I have around government reform is that nobody wants to plan for the future because nobody wants to give their opponent a political win.
And there's a valid point there, but so I do think
Anyways, that
that we
was taking us off track again.
yeah. So let's steer it back because I do want to talk about kind of the a little bit about Singapore and kind of their history, just to kind of show people like that this stuff that this idea of reform isn't a pie in the sky, theoretical great that works on paper, but no one's ever been able to do it. It's been done. So just a little bit about kind of about Singapore and kind of their history. So between 1959 and 1980, Singapore commenced on a really effective administrative reform process that rationalized and the structure and the procedures of the public bureaucracy. And the point was to promote organizational effectiveness and attain national development goals. The principles and consequences and practices which constituted the major kind of the core of what a public of the Singapore public sector reform were these: strong political will, an example of political leaders and the public servants in terms of integrity and honesty, through strict adherence to the code of conduct. One of the things that we saw come up a lot in some of these academic articles and these on these economical review stuff was the term best and brightest.
Yeah.
Was Singapore's goal was the top minds, the best and brightest in the country should work for the government. That was really the way that they had focused that. Number two was they constantly reinvented the way the government does its business in responding to external changes. It wasn't a set it and forget it. It wasn't a this has always been the way we do it. It's the idea of continuous improvement in the government that world changes, we need to change with it. We need to reinvent how we do our work because we're serving the public.
Yeah.
Number three was our favorite word, meritocracy and equal opportunities in terms of open and fair recruitment and selection based on qualifications, relevant experience. And it was really about how do we make meritocracy accessible to everyone.
Hmm.
Number four was effective performance appraisals to remove complacency. Then it was number five was market rates for civil servants. Pay civil servants to to the point that why would they ever leave their government jobs because they're as well
Yeah.
compensated as employees than the private sector. So
If
there's
you
no
want to
pull.
attract the best, you have to do something to make your positions attractive to them, right? You can't pay below market wages and expect the best people, the most talented people in any particular discipline to come work for you because
Yeah.
why?
Well, and the idea of is that like in North America we have this mind of whatever I'm doing in the public service, I could be making 10 times that in the private sector.
Three to
Well,
five.
sure, we'll say that. So, but I mean, like, that idea of if is that if you do it for the work, if you do it for your own personal motivations, you work in the public sector. But if you actually want to get paid, you move into private. Singapore was like, no, screw that. Like, market rates for civil servants.
Yeah.
And then 6 and 7 were about continual learning and doing constant reviews and improvements and determination to make and implement difficult decisions. So the idea of not doing what's not necessarily popular, doing what's proper, doing what's right. And then going back to the idea of integrity and having the best and brightest people to deliver that. That does not sound like a wild, crazy idea. Best and brightest, reinvent, evaluate changes, making
Well,
merit.
listening to those stated goals, they don't sound very different than what we are hearing in Canada and the United States.
Yeah. Now, some people might say, okay, so you're, paying, market rates to civil servants, and you're constantly reevaluating the way that you do government, and you have this, fair and equal opportunities for in recruitment. Then, it must be, the spending in Singapore must be
Ridiculously
insane,
expensive. Yeah.
right? Here's the reality. In 2022, the total government spending in Singapore was 15.4% of the economy's GDP. So the economy there that was the 15 oh, it was only 15.4% of their total economy was from government spending.
Hmm.
Compare that to Canada's, which is in 2022 was 41% of the total GDP. And when you compare that to the average for industrialized countries, including the US and the UK and in a lot of Europe, was 42.7%.
42.7% of government of the
Your
total
economy
economy
of the
was
government,
due to government spending, as
yeah,
opposed to Singapore, which was what?
15.4,
Yeah.
right? So their government spending was a whole lot less because they reformed, cut the bloat, had the best people. And honestly, like it's actually really, again, if you're remotely interested in kind of economics or any kind of stuff like we are, the stuff about Singapore is pretty cool actually. Like it is really worth kind of reading if it's something that is interesting. But I mean, here's a country making it work that actually went with reform, not with cuts, and they spend a whole lot less and they have it so much better because
And
that's
let's
the
be real,
power of
I'm
reform.
sure there were a lot of bumps along the road. There
Yeah.
were a lot of frustrations. There were a lot of
This was
times where,
this was like 20 year
well,
of hard work to get there.
and that's just it. They took a long-term approach, right? You can't set a, you can't have a strategy that focuses on the next 6 months.
Yeah.
Strategy needs to be vision casting. It needs to be, where do we want to go? How are we going to get there? And our favorite question, what needs to exist
Mhm.
for this to be successful? And they actually went through that process. They recognized that it was not going to be quick or easy, but they were dedicated to the goals of reform. And I think the results are speak for themselves.
Absolutely. And that's just it, is that it's the idea of we're going to put the work in. We're not going to look for the performative quick wins. We're going to focus on reform, not on cuts, not on layoffs. And we're going to stick it through to the end. And it works.
Yeah.
And it's something that's obtainable probably everywhere. I mean, it will look different. Could take a little bit longer, but it is obtainable because, like I said, hiring the best people, kind of reinventing the way government does services to respond to changes in the world, focusing on meritocracy, effective performance appraisals to remove complacency, market rates for civil servants, continuous learning, and determination to make difficult decisions was the playbook.
Yeah. Well, I mean, having highly skilled people in key governmental positions who are empowered to adapt to the changing realities of the fact, because stuff comes at us really quickly.
Yeah.
But doing that has allowed them to create a very powerful economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is just it, is that it's reform over layoffs, reform over cuts.
Yeah.
Because the idea of one of the things that's very popular in kind of like conservative, more like right, right side of the political spectrum is the idea of smaller government is better. And again, the idea of that's the buzzword, that's the catchphrase, that's the soundbite.
Yeah.
And it's the thesis statement for a much longer answer about how we have to actually, probably reform our governments in order to do that. And
Mhm.
that's what people don't realize is that smaller government is better is just the soundbite of a much larger statement about how we have to reform our government to cut all these things, largely do similar things to what Singapore's done. But people stop at the soundbite and go just cut people off, problem solved.
Yeah. Government's now smaller. We win.
Exactly. I cut my leg off. I weigh less. I win.
Yeah.
It
It's
really
dumb.
it is. And the idea of I don't think there's anything wrong with that political ideology of smaller government, but I think it's the idea of if you look past the soundbite and get into what that means, it means reform.
It
It
means
doesn't mean cuts.
efficient government.
Exactly. And I think that there's a lot we can learn from countries like Singapore about how we get there. But
Yeah.
it's not, again, like we said, it's not about performative solutions. It's not about quick wins. It's not about trying to just score political points in your political cycle. It's about commitment to the public service and trying to, again, make sure that you're focusing on reform and focusing on the long-term success of your country rather than just trying to maintain your popularity while you're viable for government.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. I think that's kind of about it. I don't really have much else to say to you.
Yeah. I mean, this was a bit of a different episode for us.
Yeah,
But I really enjoyed I like the topical nature of it. It's an important one. It is a bit of a deviation from our some of our standard topics, but I think it's an important one to have kind of highlighted and brought some interesting conversation around.
I agree. All right. So that about does it for us. For a full archive of the podcast and access the video version hosted on our YouTube channel, visit roman3.ca/podcast. Thanks for joining us.
For more information on topics like these, don't forget to visit us at roman3.ca. Side effects of this podcast may include improved retention, high productivity, increased market share, employees breaking out in spontaneous dance, dry mouth, aversion to the sound of James's voice, desire to find a better podcast.